Buongiorno e benvenuti a tutti a questo nuovo appuntamento della rassegna Host in Translation. Naturalmente uno speciale benvenuto va ai nostri ospiti, alla professoressa Bina Agarwal, che è collegata dall'India, e ad Alessandro Merli, che condurrà l'incontro. Come consuetudine, il mio compito è quello di presentarveli. Bina Agarwal è un'economista, attualmente professore ordinario di Development Economics and Environment nell'Università di Manchester, nel Regno Unito. In precedenza ha insegnato a Delhi. È stata presidente dell'International Society for Ecological Economics, vicepresidente dell'International Economic Association e ha ricevuto prestigiosi riconoscimenti accademici da altre università, tra cui Cambridge, Harvard e Princeton. È interessante ricordare che ha fatto anche parte della commissione che ha redatto il rapporto Stiglitz nel 2010, insieme a economisti e scienziati sociali come lei di primissimo piano, ricorderete Sen, Fitoussi, Atkinson, Sunstein, e non ultimo l'attuale ministro Enrico Giovannini. La professoressa Agarwal ha pubblicato testi fondamentali usciti nel Regno Unito a partire dal 94, quando è uscito il suo fondamentale A Field of One's Own, Gender and Land Rights in South Asia, e i suoi lavori pionieristici sulla diseguaglianza di genere per i diritti e la gestione della proprietà terriera e la governance ambientale hanno avuto un impatto rilevantissimo a livello mondiale, valendole molti riconoscimenti e premi. In Italia ha ricevuto il premio Balzan nel 2017 e è tuttora membro dell'Accademia dei Lincei. Come ha messo bene in evidenza il professor Quadrio Curzio nella sua prefazione, la professoressa Agarwal si è distinta per l'originalità delle domande che si è posta e quindi per percorsi di ricerca completamente nuovi che ha aperto nella sua carriera di studiosa. Si è avventurata anche in territori inesplorati, dove ha raggiunto risultati molto rilevanti, tanto sul piano concettuale che su quello empirico. Oggi al centro della conversazione c'è la diseguaglianza di genere nelle economie in via di sviluppo, che esce per la prima volta direttamente in italiano e raccoglie i saggi che la stessa autrice ha selezionato come fondamentali nei numerosi ambiti di ricerca in cui lei si è impegnata. Infatti la professoressa Agarwal è sì un'economista, ma ha dovuto attingere agli studi giuridici, antropologici e sociologici per affrontare i temi a cui si è dedicata. La diseguaglianza di genere in agricoltura, nella tecnologia, nella sicurezza alimentare. Ha affrontato il tema della proprietà, dei diritti sulla terra. Ha lavorato con interviste sul campo, dimostrando che la proprietà può essere un deterrente molto potente alla violenza domestica. La proprietà, ci dice, emancipa le donne in tutte le società, rurali o urbane che siano. Ha dimostrato che se le donne si mettono insieme e fanno massa critica hanno più forza. Ci sono pagine molto belle in questo libro sulla rivendicazione delle decisioni sulle foreste da parte delle donne, che sono le prime fruitrici di questo ambiente. Quindi è evidente che le sue incursioni nell'antropologia e nella sociologia sono state necessarie, sono state molto ampie e hanno fatto corpo con la sua analisi economica. Ecco, direi che questa interdisciplinarità la caratterizza fortemente. È andata intorno ad argomenti molto caldi e quindi è stato quasi inevitabile che la professoressa abbia coniugato l'attività scientifica con l'impegno attivo in dibattiti e campagne politiche, in particolare nella campagna da lei condotta per ottenere la riforma delle leggi indiane sulla successione nel 2005. La conversazione sarà in lingua inglese e sarà condotta da Alessandro Merli. Alessandro Merli, ormai lo conosciamo, è fellow della Scuola di Studi Internazionali della Johns Hopkins University a Bologna e docente alla Bologna Business School. In precedenza ha lavorato per il Sole 24 Ore, con l'incarico tra l'altro di corrispondente da Londra e da Francoforte. A questo punto passo la parola a Alessandro Merli, ringraziandolo per averci accompagnato in questa rassegna con la solita elevata professionalità. Alessandro, a te la parola, a tutti grazie dell'attenzione e un buon pomeriggio.
Grazie Monica. We now switch to English. Thank you for your kind introduction, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this talk with Professor Bina Agarwal. It is indeed an honor to be talking to Professor Agarwal, who has done so much path-breaking research within economics, and as Monica has already reminded us, in complementing with the work in so many other adjacent and not so adjacent disciplines. She ventured into legal history and other aspects. She's been a campaigner for the reform of law of succession in India, so is really more than an economist, a personality that's left, I think, a mark in South Asia and globally. Without further ado, I'll give Professor Bina Agarwal the floor, and she will present a bit of her work, this collection of articles that's been published just now by Il Mulino, and after that we'll have hopefully space for some questions from myself and hopefully from the audience. You can input your questions in the comment section or in the Q&A section of the respective platform through which you're connected to us, and then I'll relate them to Professor Agarwal. Professor Agarwal, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Monica. Thank you, Alessandro, for that wonderful introduction. So let me begin by telling you that the idea of this book came actually from Professor Alberto Quadrio Curzio, whom I have known for many years. And he suggested a volume bringing together some of my key papers in Italian translation and put me in touch with the publishers Mulino, which is a very distinguished publisher. So I was very honored and I immediately agreed, since it was an exciting opportunity to share with my fellow intellectuals in Italy my ideas on important aspects of gender inequality. So I warmly thank Professor Quadrio Curzio for making this book possible. I also thank Monica Albertoni and her team, especially Valentina Tosti, for the excellent production, as well as the book's outstanding translators. Now, although today wealth and income inequality has come to the forefront of academic and policy debate, the question of gender inequality still remains under-examined in many aspects. Inequality which can have serious adverse effects not only on the welfare of women and children, but also on the country's development. And this is what provides the backdrop to my research. Now, the book contains 11 key papers and an afterword. The papers are organized around three main themes of my research. One is property, family, and work. The second is agriculture and food security. And the third is environmental change and community action. Now, some of the papers are theoretical, others are largely empirical. And I will provide some highlights to entice you to read the book. Now, the book on property, family, and work, which is the first part, it begins with one of my, in a sense, important theoretical contributions, namely the contribution to theories of the household. Now, conventional economic theory depicts the household as a unitary model, especially as enunciated by Nobel laureate Gary Becker. Now, this model assumes that all household incomes are pooled, family members share common interests and preferences, and an altruistic household head ensures equitable allocation of resources, subject to a budget constraint. Now, observed reality, of course, is very different. We know that family members differ greatly in their tastes and preferences, and there's a vast body of empirical evidence which has built up, which reveals deep gender inequalities within households in access to assets, education, healthcare, and work sharing. Now, these inequalities cannot be explained by the unitary household model. They are better explained by bargaining models, which recognize that intra-household interactions contain elements of both cooperation and conflict. And outcomes depend on a person's bargaining power. Now, my contribution to bargaining models, I believe, is threefold. Firstly, I argue that a person's bargaining power depends not only on income, as most economists might argue, but also on property ownership, on access to community resources, and qualitative factors such as social norms, social perceptions, and social support networks. Now, women typically have lower bargaining power than men on most of these counts, leading to greater, to gender unequal intra-household outcomes. Secondly, in my contribution here, unlike mainstream economic theory, which assumes that social norms are fixed, I argue that social norms themselves can be bargained over. And third, I extend the bargaining approach beyond the household to include the market, the community, and the state. All of these three institutions, in addition to the family, have deeply embedded inequalities. So, for instance, labor markets have large gender wage gaps, communities often restrict women's mobility, and women are poorly represented in state institutions. Also, interventions in one arena can affect women's bargaining power in other arenas. So, for instance, if the government makes cash transfers to women rather than to men, it enhances women's bargaining power at home. Similarly, if husbands share childcare, it enhances women's bargaining power in the job market. But one of the most important factors that can enhance women's bargaining power in many arenas is ownership of immovable property, land and house. Now, this is a topic on which my research and policy contributions are perhaps best known, namely gender inequality in the ownership of property, especially land. I began working on this a long time ago. In 1985, when I began my research on women's land rights, there was no major work on the subject globally. Most researchers and policymakers saw employment as the chief indicator of women's economic status, rather than property. And economists working on income inequalities, such as Tony Atkinson, Amartya Sen, and many others, did not focus on the gender gap in property. So I had to break new ground. In doing so, I moved beyond the narrow confines of mainstream economics, examine how property defines people's economic and social status, political power, citizenship rights, and sense of identity. Now, the implications of women lacking property affects theirs and their families' well-being, as well as the wider economy. Now, in my arguments, I drew on law, on economics, on anthropology and history when I wrote my 1994 book, Field of One's Own, Gender and Land Rights in South Asia, as well as several papers. One of those papers is in this volume. Now, Field of One's Own covered 5 countries, so I taught myself inheritance laws of each country. Now, these were very complex because they varied by religion, by region, and by type of property. I also examined why there is a gender gap between law and practice. And why is the gap higher in northern South Asia relative to South India and Sri Lanka? And what I found was that an important factor underlying these regional differences are marriage norms. So, for instance, in South India and Sri Lanka, communities allow women to marry cross cousins and within the birth village. So here parents are more willing to recognize a daughter's land rights since the land remains within the family's control. In North India, marriages are with strangers in distant villages, and parents rarely give daughters land. Now, these north-south patterns also play out in other gender variables, such as sex ratios, women's education, and work participation, all of which are worse in northern South Asia compared to southern South Asia. And these patterns are explained better by culture than religion. So one could argue that today's politicians are promoting religious identities, denying people's shared cultural tradition. And over time, this can undermine, have negative economic implications as well. Now, in later research, I found that owning property also protects women from domestic violence. So using primary data for 500 randomly selected rural and urban households in Kerala, in South India, a colleague and I found that the incidence of domestic violence was 49% among propertyless women and only 7% among women owning land and home. Employment did not provide women the same protection. And I spell this out in chapter 3 of this volume. Now, in chapter 4, I look at employment. Some of you may know that there is a major debate today on why Indian women's labor force participation has been falling. Underlying this are many factors: a lack of jobs for women, their heavy domestic workload, but also the statistics which undercount women's work. In particular, women's unpaid care work is greatly undercounted. And this chapter 4 in the volume outlines these data biases. Now, in this chapter, I also provide evidence which disproves assumptions that women are less efficient and productive than men. In fact, the FAO's 2011 report on the state of agriculture collated global studies to show that if women farmers had the same access to land and inputs as men, they could increase their crop yields by 20 to 30%, and country-level agricultural output by 2.4 to 4%. So, so this is just some glimpses of the work in part 1. Now, part 2 of the volume covers agriculture and food security, and this I approach from different angles. So, for instance, I ask, are there intra-household gender inequalities in food allocations? How do poor rural families cope with food shortages? What is the effect of climate change? What role do women farmers play in global food security? Does group farming offer a solution to small and falling farm size? Now, the evidence on intra-household allocation shows that women tend to bear the brunt of food shortages. They tend to eat last and least in poor households, and even might sell their limited assets if needed to help the family survive, especially in case of severe droughts or famines. Now, in my work on food security, I extend Amartya Sen's, Nobel laureate Amartya Sen's entitlement approach to food security by linking it to my work on intra-household bargaining. Also, I use insights from women's coping strategies in past calamities for analyzing the impact of COVID-19. This is in my more recent work. It is not included in the volume. More generally, women farmers are key to global food security, especially with the feminization of agriculture. But globally, few women own land. So in India, barely 14% of landowners are women in rural landowning households. Also, 84% of family farms in 111 countries cultivate under 2 hectares. So most farms are too small to be economically viable. So given this, I asked this question: can a solution lie in farmers pooling their resources to cultivate jointly? And in chapter 7 of the volume, I discuss this idea. I outline the potential benefits of group farming, such as providing economies of scale, a large pool of funds and skills, and saving on labor and input costs. Now, evidence, especially from the transition economies, showed that group farms had higher productivity than small family farms. In my more recent work on group farming in India, I find that this holds for India as well. So, for instance, I found that group farms in Kerala and East India had higher productivity and profits than small family farms. They also empower women socially and politically. So this brings me to the third part of the volume, which is on environmental change and community action. In this, I move from fields to forests, in particular to environmental change. Now, this is a subject on which I have worked for several decades. I had an earlier book called Cold Hearts and Barren Slopes, which was published in 1986. Of course, this issue has now become very central. Sustainable development and environmental governance, in fact, represent this century's biggest challenges. Yet, without a gender perspective, I believe our scientific analysis and our policy solutions will be ineffective. In the book, I demonstrate why in 4 chapters. First, I examine the relationship between women and nature. So in this, I criticize the ecofeminist argument that women have a special relationship with nature due to their biology or ideology. I argue that this ignores differences between women due to their class and their rural-urban location. And this would affect both their dependence on natural resources and their knowledge of nature. So instead, I present an alternative theory, which I call feminist environmentalism. And I argue that both women and men in rural contexts have an interest in conserving nature's resources on which they depend, such as forests. But their dependence is for different products. So for instance, women's dependence on forests is much more for firewood, for fodder, and men's for timber. And each is knowledgeable about the particular products that they collect. So we need policies that increase women's access to ecological resources and enhance their participation in environmental governance. So this paper, where I critique ecofeminism and present this alternative, has been translated into, which is in this volume. It's been translated into Spanish and French, and now I'm very glad it's also into Italian. In chapter 9 of the volume, I examine the interlinkages between gender, poverty, and environmental vulnerability in rural India, focusing on variations across regions and over time. So I first created a series of indices for gender bias, environmental disadvantage, and poverty, which I term GEP indices, GEP. Then I use the methodology which UNDP uses to create the Human Development Index, to create a composite index, which I call the GEP-GAP index, to measure variations in gender, environment, and poverty vulnerability across Indian states and over time. And what I found was that in some states, such as Bihar in eastern India, all 3 vulnerabilities were high and overlapping. In other states, such as in South India, like Kerala, all 3 elements were low. But in Northwest India, despite low poverty and high prosperity, the states did poorly on the environment as well as in terms of gender. There was, in fact, a high anti-female bias. So, in other words, economic prosperity alone cannot guarantee gender equality or environmental sustainability. The final 2 papers in this section then address the question of gender and forest governance from 2 different standpoints. One focuses on women's absence from governance, the other, the impact of their presence. And both are based on extensive fieldwork that I did and my team in India and Nepal. Now, chapter 10 focuses on women's low presence in community forestry groups. And I ask, well, what factors obstruct effective participation? And from my fieldwork, I found that 6 types of factors were important which obstructed women. One is rules of entry, social norms, social perceptions, men's entrenched territorial claims, women's own endowments, and their households' endowments. These, I argue, reduce women's bargaining power, both within the household and outside it, and they undermine their ability to participate effectively in community meetings. Women's participation could, however, be enhanced if they had enough numbers to constitute a critical mass. So in chapter 11, I move from women's absence in environmental governance to the little addressed question, what impact will women's presence have? Now, in fact, in 2010, I wrote a book called Gender and Green Governance, where I address many dimensions of this question. I look at the impact of women's presence on rulemaking, on rule violations, on conservation outcomes, and equity. I also tested what proportion of women constitute a critical mass. And I came up with a figure of 25 to 33%. Now, many of you would know that 1/3 has long been used globally by women's groups to lobby for seat reservation in parliament. But it hadn't been rigorously empirically tested before, which I did in the book. The question then was, did groups with a critical mass of women in the executive committees do better in terms of conservation outcomes? So chapter 11 in this volume addresses this question based on my primary data on community forestry groups in West India and Nepal. Now, collecting such data in the early 2000s was not easy. There were serious security risks in Nepal, and we administered 9 types of questionnaires, used diverse methodologies and data sets, including satellite data, to assess forest condition. And the results were striking. Forest protection groups with a critical mass of women in the executive committee showed significantly higher improvement in forest condition in both countries. Including women helped improve protection efforts, and women's knowledge of local ecology enhanced the biodiversity and regeneration. In the long term, however, we must also frame policies to reduce rural women's dependence on forests. For instance, we need to use material other than wood for house building and clean natural gas to replace firewood in cooking. Now, the final chapter in the book is an afterword, which gives, given the diversity of issues, we might ask, well, what kind of gender analysis has most effectively challenged mainstream economics? Now, in the afterword, I suggest some answers. I note that I suggest that the most effective challenges are posed where the initial thrust is theoretical, where there's strong potential for formal modeling and empirical testing, and the results demonstrate significant efficiency and equity gains, which can affect policy shifts. By these criteria, bargaining household models explaining intra-household allocations have provided one of the most effective challenges to mainstream economics. Research on gender inequality in labor markets and on property ownership have also effectively challenged the mainstream and opened up new pathways for analysis. So this gives you a broad overview of the volume. But before I end, I'll show you some slides on the important points, especially because some of you may not be directly English speakers. So if you would give me a minute to share my slides. So I hope you can see the slides. Now this first slide is simply gives you the contents, table of contents, the 3 parts I talked about in the book, and then the different chapters and the afterword. Now the first part is property, family, and work. And this is a diagram. I remember I talked to you about my theoretical contribution on bargaining and gender relations. And what this basically shows is the 4 arenas of bargaining: household, community, market, and the state. And in the middle are the factors which could affect bargaining power, including property ownership and social norms and perceptions. So if women get support in one arena, it can increase their bargaining power in other arenas. So for instance, if the government transfers resources to women in the household rather than to men, it will increase women's bargaining power in the home. This slide gives you a picture of A Field of Unsown, my 1994 book, but also there's a lot of work that's been done by many feminist economists on this, and these figures show you that whether you look at India or you look at some of the other countries and other regions, there is a vast gender gap in terms of ownership of land, which is a primary form of property. So women landowners as a percent of all landowners, even Latin America across 5 countries, range from 11 to 27% only. Now, these maps will highlight how social norms can actually affect economic outcomes. So if you will recall, I had mentioned that in southern South Asia, women are allowed by social norms to marry within the village and village endogamy, and they can marry their cross cousins. The greener it is, the more women-friendly the region is on particular indicators. So you can see the difference between southern northeast in India, and then of course here Pakistan, you have social norms which are positive in this respect. And the middle part of this region is white, which shows that there are patriarchal norms are strongest here. Below, you will see that these are economic variables, the legal rights in property in the 1990s and female labor force participation rates. And as you can see, again, that there is a north-south difference. And this has been, of course, carried over in many other developmental indicators. So overall, you can see how culture can mediate economic outcomes for women. This slide relates to the work that I had mentioned on how property status, women's property status can affect domestic violence, spousal violence. And here you can see that women who are propertyless, the incidence of violence is 49%, whereas it's dramatically lower if they own house or land, 7%, or if they own one or the other, it's still very much lower than if they were propertyless. It's immovable property which matters more, which is house and land. I'll show you 2 or 3 slides from the second part. Firstly, what we see is a feminization of agriculture. As you can see globally that these graphs, except in the case of Europe, they move upwards. This is because more men than women first move to non-farm jobs, leaving women to manage the land and the farms. And this is the feminization of agriculture, but typically women don't own land that they manage, and they're also disadvantaged in terms of access to inputs, technology, and information and markets. Now, and this is the report by the FAO, which had argued that, in fact, bridging these gender gaps in access to inputs, including land and credit, can increase crop yields of women farmers by 20 to 30%, and also can make a big difference to the country's agricultural output in developing countries, ranging from 2.5 to 4%. Now, given that most women don't own land, is it possible that there are other ways by which they could access land and do viable and create viable livelihoods? And this is, I argue that that group farming could provide one such alternative. And here I give you some figures of the productivity and profitability in my empirical research, where I compare all women's group farms and individual family farms, 95% of which are male managed. And I look at the annual value of output per hectare, annual net returns per farm. And as you can see, the annual value of output per hectare, this is in rupees, is 1.8 times higher for group farms than individual family farms. And the annual net returns per farm are 5 times higher under group farming than under individual family farming. And this picture is from Kerala. As you can see, the women are using their technology And this is also extremely helpful. So group farming basically involves pooling land, labor, capital, skills, and sharing costs and benefits. The third part, I'll show you a couple of slides here. One of the papers was about excluding women from community forestry. I coined the term participatory exclusions, and I asked the question, can you spot women? And these two in red are women, and as you can see, they're too few. They're not a critical mass. They're too few to be, and they're usually quite shy, and they won't speak up in a male-dominated meeting. However, in the rest of the volume, I talk about the impact of inclusion. And this is a picture of gender and green governance. And in the volume, I have a chapter which looks at forest conservation outcomes. And as I had mentioned, that if you have a critical mass of women, it makes a big difference to conservation outcomes. It improves protection efforts, and also women bring their knowledge of ecology to bear on regeneration of forests. But over time, we must reduce our dependence on forests. For instance, if you're talking about firewood, then it's not a clean fuel, and biogas is a much cleaner fuel, and it causes major health problems. In fact, indoor cooking smoke in developing countries, it's found that women's risk of mortality is 50% higher than men's. So it is both to save both for conservation reasons and also for health reasons. Shifting to cleaner fuels is important, and similarly, shifting from timber, cutting out trees for timber for building houses and repairing houses, we need alternative materials for that. So finally, which are the kinds of work that challenge feminist economic work, which challenge the mainstream? I'd mentioned that especially where there is a thrust is theoretical, there's possibility of formal testing and modeling. It has equity and efficiency gains, and policy shifts are possible. And which areas have had particularly an impact? Now, there can be a debate on this. In my view, bargaining theories of the household have been an important challenge, labor market inequalities, environmental governance issues, and property and wealth inequalities. So, so this is I'm asking, well, when is it that we'll move from inequality to equality? Now, having said that, let me conclude by saying that I hope this volume will give Italian readers a flavor of some key dimensions of gender inequality, both in developing countries and globally. Also, my empirical examples, although they are from developing countries, I hope that the theoretical insights they provide will have global relevance. So with those words, I look forward to the response of the volume, especially from my Italian readers. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Agarwal. Even from this brief presentation, we gathered the breadth of your research, and it's a real tour de force over the course of your research career. So there are many questions. Some from the audience. We'll try and address them in turn. One thing that strikes me, just looking at the book, is the amount of data that you can see, and data, of course, is preeminent in today's world. There's data everywhere. The fact that it's data everywhere means that most economists do not have to collect their own data because it's already available somewhere. In your case, you had to create your own database, in a sense. Why was that needed? I mean, you mentioned the fact that at some point in Nepal it was maybe even dangerous to collect your own data. What were the challenges of building this data, which were basically non-existent before you tackled certain issues?
Thank you, Alessandro, for that question. Well, I use secondary data also where available, and you need a large data set. But really it depends on your research questions. So when you explore new research pathways, I believe you have to collect your own data. Also, I work on institutions. So most surveys cover households or individuals, not institutions. So if you take my work, for instance, on community forestry groups or on group farming, which I've studied, these are institutions which require information from the field, because these are not questions that have been asked before. And also, so to take an example, to measure critical mass, I needed to know how many women and men had attended meetings of community forestry groups. And so the field team checked out the minutes of the meetings over several years. And now that kind of data are not available automatically. In addition, I believe that for insights into your econometric results, you need to understand the context. You need field knowledge. So for my research, for instance, on community forestry, even before I systematically did a survey, I traveled for several months across several states of India and Nepal, just talking to village communities. And this was very important in helping me to frame questions and to innovate methodologically. But as you mentioned, fieldwork is not easy. My research team in Nepal sometimes had to walk an entire day to reach the next village and find a place to sleep on arrival. So even if you made advanced arrangements, it could be risky. You might end up sleeping out in the open or in the veranda. And so, one could write a whole book on that. But I believe economists must be open to both, to doing fieldwork, because otherwise it limits the questions that you can address.
Well, what you said just gives a new meaning or a literal meaning to the word field work, I guess. Of course, you are well known, and you've been a pioneer on the issue of gender inequality in property in particular, and not only in South Asia, but globally. And the question of inequality has now moved center stage even in the political discourse, even in Western countries, in advanced economies. And there were books from male economists of the like of Thomas Piketty or Branko Milanovic. Yet, these economists do not touch, for instance, at all on gender inequality. Why do you think that's the case?
It's, of course, a question they need to answer, but there could be several reasons. Of course, many economists focus at the macro level, cross-country analysis, for instance, of wealth inequality, or they focus at the household level, rather than intra-household wealth inequalities. Secondly, most data are not disaggregated by gender. So, for instance, if you look at the FAO database, which provides gender data on land ownership, it only covers 20 countries. But I think perhaps there is also a gender divide in research. So almost all studies on gender inequality in land owned have been led by economists. But male economists often don't engage with or cite this work. So there is a degree of disconnect between the two. And I think it would be very fruitful if there was much closer interchange. And there was much more engagement by male economists for the work of women economists, but particularly the work on gender inequality. So there's a bridging role.
In the presentation, I think you mentioned several times the question of critical mass in empowering women to have more voice in community institutions. You mentioned this forest committees, but of course this is something that touches on other fields. You mentioned the question of quotas, for instance, in legislative bodies, in parliaments. There's also the question of quotas, for instance, in corporate boardrooms, in companies, especially large companies or in listed companies. What is your view on quotas? Are they just a temporary tool, or they should be made permanent to obtain this empowerment of women?
Well, I believe that quotas can help a lot to make the initial breakthrough. because once women enter, they can demonstrate their capabilities and overcome pre-existing negative perceptions about their capabilities. Because if you don't get a chance to prove yourself, you're not going to be able to do that. And India is a good example. For instance, 1/3 seats were reserved for women heads of village councils in 1992 by a constitutional amendment. And over time, in many states, people now elect women over and above the quotas, since they find women are more sincere, more efficient, and so on. And the same could happen in legislative bodies and boardrooms. So I believe quotas can be a starting point in breaking the ceiling. They need not be permanent. Over time, I think women will stand on their own as well.
Now, of course, you looked a lot at grassroots, and you've done a lot of field research, but change always, sometimes also comes from the top. A number of countries have had female political leaders. Your own country had Indira Gandhi. There was Thatcher in the UK, and then a younger generation, if I can say so, like Merkel in Germany or Hillary Clinton in the US. Do you think they've helped empower women or created policies to reduce gender inequality, or were they, in a way thought that their own success depended on being more like men?
Well, firstly, of course, the list has become much longer. As you know, we can add Benazir Bhutto, we can add Golda Meir, we can add the current Prime Minister of New Zealand, who's been so effective in dealing with COVID. So I think this is a very good question. I believe women leaders can have a twofold effect. Firstly, they can be role models, so that has a demonstration effect. But the second is a more key question, which is, can they change policies towards gender equality? Now, in practice, I think many women leaders certainly have succeeded on the first count, but they have not necessarily been that effective on the second count. Because if you look at the policies of the leaders that you've mentioned, they have not been known particularly for their policies on promoting gender equality. Now, my own research suggests that leaders who had prior links with the women's movement are more likely to bring in policies to empower women. And there are examples from the United States in the 2000s, from South Africa in the 1990s, and so on. But what is true is that being a woman leader at the top does not guarantee gender sensitivity. What matters is whether the leaders see women as a political constituency. And even male leaders can then begin to make a difference. So in the current ongoing elections in South India and Tamil Nadu, for instance, several male politicians have promised women wages for housework. Now, this is, of course, you can say, well, this is instrumental. It's not because they particularly necessarily believe in gender equality. But what I'm saying is that instrumentality can work for all leaders. When they see women as a vote bank and as a constituency, that is where you begin to see much more sensitivity towards the policies which affect women. But women leaders who have prior connections with the women's movement would incorporate policies even without that. I think policies have also changed over time, given the huge body of research on gender inequality, which has emerged over the last few decades, and the women's movements in different countries as well.
Of course, there's the famous quote from Christine Lagarde, formerly at the IMF, now at the ECB, who said about the global financial crisis that instead of Lehman Brothers, we'd had Lehman Sisters. Maybe we wouldn't have the crisis. But I'm not sure if that is true, but there may be some truth in that. And we now have a lot of female leaders at the head of international institutions, the IMF itself, the ECB, now the WTO. So maybe there's some hope there. There's another thing I wanted to mention is that and that you mentioned in your presentation is your work on group farming and the potential of it to overcome the problem of small farms, of the size of the too small size of farms in South Asia. Do you think group farming has relevance or potential outside places like South Asia? I'm thinking of some of the rural areas in Europe, maybe southeastern Europe. I mean, we are of course talking from the capital of cooperative, Bologna, where your Italian publisher is based, is kind of the land of cooperatives. So I was wondering if you think this has relevance for Europe.
Well, firstly, I think it's relevant certainly much in other developing countries, much beyond South Asia, because I had mentioned that 111 countries, globally, the 84% of the farmers cultivate less than 2 hectares. Some of those are also in Europe. But independent of that, I have studied group farming in France and Romania, and I've also found group farming in Norway and in Ireland. Now, in France, in fact, 15% of all farms are group farms with more than 2 associates. And typically, however, in Europe, group farms are more prevalent among milk and meat farmers because looking after animals is very labor intensive. So working in groups allows farmers to share not only the costs and the risks, but also the work burdens. And if you talk to French farmers, they say it enables us to at least take an annual holiday. Now, of course, there are differences in the group farms if you compare them to South Asia versus Europe, because European group farms are much larger in size. They are over, in terms of land area, it could be 100 to 150 hectares or more. But I believe there is, given that they are quite active in France, in Norway, in Ireland, and so on, I think there is, and Romania. I've studied Romania in recent years. I think there is a case to be made and a future for group farming. And this is not just cooperatives, this is not just service cooperatives. I mean, this is actually pooling your land and resources to work together.
Now I want to ask a question not just to the economist, but to the campaigner, because of course you're not only a scholar, very eminent scholar, but you've been a campaigner for women's rights. You led a famous campaign in 2005, I think Monica mentioned that in her presentation, to have Hindu inheritance law changed so that it would make it gender equal in India in terms of inheritance. And this campaigning activity is not very usual for an academic. I was wondering what motivated you to do so, and how did this complement your research, and how your research complemented this activity as a campaigner? And if I may, I want to complete this question, one that's come from the audience, from Rita Cenni, who's based in Bologna, has been for a long time a correspondent journalist in India, and she asked a question about the role of women in the recent farmers' protests in India that have been going on since, I believe, last November. Have women played a role or a significant role in these protests?
2 different questions. Thank you for those questions. So on the first one, when I was researching for my 1994 book, A Field of One's Own, I taught myself the inheritance laws in great depth. And of course, in looking at those laws, I recognized the particular ways in which there were gender inequalities embedded in the laws. So, and I'd written about this also in the newspapers. So in the winter of 2004, the government of India introduced a bill in Parliament, but it was quite a flawed bill, to amend the Hindu Succession Act of 1956. But it had left, this bill left most of the gender inequalities intact that I had identified. So I initially wrote an edit page piece to point this out, thinking that NGOs will take it up. But in January of 2005, when nobody actually came forward, I decided to plunge in. It was really a plunge in because I had no prior experience of doing this. And I thought, okay, let me try and see what I can do. And it was an opportunity to use one's academic knowledge. So I had a lot of contacts among civil society groups, and 2 of them agreed to partner with me in the campaign. And many, many people signed the petitions that we prepared. I must tell you, Alessandro, that I also deposed before the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Law and Justice, which is a bipartisan committee, to which the bill had been referred for amendment. I met with the then Prime Minister, Manmohan Singh, and several legislators. So it's a long story, but in August of 2005, 8 months after our campaign began, an amended bill was, which was gender equal on all the major counts, was passed by Parliament. So the motivation was, therefore, that I had the knowledge of what needed to be done, and there was an opportunity which rarely comes in a researcher's life to actually use your research to larger purpose. And I also have had a long-standing, I've been part of the women's movement in India and globally. So all those factors actually came together. Now, on this question from Bologna, the role of women in the recent farmers' movements, where women have been very visible in the farmers' protests since last November. There have been many categories of women, many thousand women, and on the 8th of March, there was that really escalated. Women, of course, are very important partners in farming. They often either manage the farms themselves when the men have moved to non-farm jobs. You remember my graph on feminization of agriculture. But also they have a very high stake in family farms. So women's participation reflected that stake that they had. Women are much more women as workers are much more dependent on agriculture than men. So their stake is particularly high. There are also Dalit women among them who normally who were agitating as well earlier prior to these farmers' protests to get land, common land for cultivation. Having said that, I must mention that, of course, women have always been in the forefront of peasant movements in India and globally. But what is often missing is that they don't raise their own claims to the land that is cultivated. And I'm hoping that with the huge visibility that this protest has brought, they will be able over time to raise claims for equality for family land as well.
We have 2 questions again from the audience, from Bruno Dorin, and I'll read them to you. He's asking about your assessment of productivity in Kerala, and you assessed the land and compared the land productivity in Kerala, and he's asking what about labor productivity, which is the most important thing for the farmer. And he also asks if you have figures on net income by work unit, women and men, by class of farm size. That may be a bit more complicated in this sort of context, but maybe you can point to a piece of your research. So the labor productivity in Kerala and the net income.
Well, thank you for those questions. No, I don't, all the assessments I have made have been per hectare because land is a particularly scarce resource in the South Asian context. I know in Europe you would look at labor units, but here I looked at land units because it's the shortage of land. Many of the women who were working on these group farms were earlier by their histories were underemployed in terms of the possibility of work, and so for them so I believe that land productivity is the important measure. The net incomes I do have, in what I've shown you was just a cross tab. So in my regressions in the actual papers I've published, I control for all the inputs, labor use, fertilizer, pesticides, and so on, and also demographic factors, the age of the women, the size of the farm as well, and then see whether being in a group makes a significant difference, and it does make a significant difference in terms of the annual value of output per hectare, and also particular crops, like if you take the banana crop or you take food grains. So don't hide, but I would encourage you to read the actual papers. There are several papers on India, as well as on, by the way, there's a paper on Romania and one on France as well.
There's another question from the audience from Raghupati, who's asking about your example of Tamil Nadu, and he's asking if it's a sign of increasing bargaining power of women, especially in the light of interconnections between different arenas that you mentioned, the state, the family, the community, and cross influences.
So Raghu, thank you for the question. It's rather difficult to actually make a connection between what some of the politicians have put in the manifesto in Tamil Nadu and the 4 arenas, but certainly in the arena of the state, I think that's where I would locate. They have greater bargaining power, and that's why it's playing out, because they are seen as a political constituency, and women often don't always vote in the same way as their spouses do, and that recognition is also important, I believe, in them trying to woo women voters. Now, of course, there's a debate in India, and it's not necessary that everybody agrees that wages for housework is the best way to go, because people would much rather that housework was distributed among men and women within the home. But nevertheless, the fact that politicians are paying attention and heed to it, and I believe this is this particular putting this in the manifesto is the first time that I've seen it. So that is in the four categories. Is the state arena where they have greater bargaining power.
There is another question from Silvia Bersanelli, who's asking about the situation of women with disability. I imagine she refers to the rural context in India. I don't know. I'm not sure what she is referring to. Maybe to the fact that are women with disability. Is there any particular consideration or recognition for women with disability in this rural context in India?
Well, there are laws relating to disability. There are also civil society groups which are working on, if you mean physical or mental disabilities. I can't tell you off the top of my head which particular schemes that the government has and so on. But I do know that there are schemes, but they are woefully inadequate. I do believe. So unless you mean caste disability, and that's a very different question. So if you want to clarify that.
I'll bring you to today's news, which unfortunately was also yesterday's news and probably tomorrow's news. We're all witnessing today the COVID-19 pandemic, and there are many ways in which the pandemic has affected women in particular, and people think that the pandemic has been a setback for the progress of women in society or in the economy, and or has stopped or hindered the progress. I wonder if you can say something about that. Can you comment on that?
Okay, it's a very large question. Of course, we know that in medical terms, both in India and globally, if you take the morbidity rates, mortality rates, they are lower for women than men. But women have suffered disproportionately in many other ways. Firstly, millions of households, as we know in India, have become poor, and they move from the non-poor to the poor category and become food insecure, with large-scale loss of livelihoods. Now, women bear the burden of intra-household inequalities in the sharing of food. If there's shortages, as I'd said, they are the last, they eat last and least. So when hunger prevails, I think they bear the burden of it. Also, as in many other countries, women have faced an increase in their domestic workload and domestic violence under lockdowns. And although both men and women in India have lost jobs, because both are largely employed in the informal sector, but in absolute numbers, larger proportion of men have lost jobs than women. But the job recovery has been much lower for women because they are employed in a much narrower set of occupations which are much more insecure. For instance, if you take domestic help, they have lost, large numbers have lost their jobs. Now, in the long run, this situation could worsen as they are forced to sell their assets for family survival. So, for instance, for millions of women who are street vendors, self-employed and street vendors, if they have to sell their assets, it would be very difficult to recover the capital. Now, having talked, I've written several papers in more detail on the negative effects by gender. But the one example where women have done better than men is when they have been farming in groups. So in the case of Kerala, for instance, of the over 30,000 women group farms in March of last year, 87% of them survived economically. And they did much better than individual male family farmers. So I think institutional solutions could provide a way forward as we think of post-pandemic recovery and as we also think of how do we build back better.
Well, this is a fascinating conversation. Unfortunately, we're coming fast towards the end of the time that is allocated to us, but I would ask you to go out on a limb a little bit and answer your own question, because at the end of your presentation, you showed us these scales and asked the question, when will gender equality come? And so I now pose you the question and ask you what you think, what time frame we're thinking of, 5, 15, 50 years?
I won't even attempt that, Alessandro. So we'd have to talk in two ways. Firstly, I think on certain counts, it's likely to move much faster than on other counts. So, for instance, if you look at women's education, school enrollments, for instance, both in India and many other countries, both girls and boys are now in school. Although in terms of the degree of dropout, there are gender differences. But I expect that in terms of schooling, the gender gap, which has been declining in developing countries globally also, will be declining. So that's at one end. The other is, which is much more difficult to change, is our social norms, especially about sharing within households. And there's an enormous literature which has come up now on the care economy, on domestic work sharing, and that affects women in the labor market. So if you have the double burden of domestic work and childcare and elder care, then your possibilities of working outside the home diminish, and your options also diminish. It reduces your mobility. So those inequalities require change in thinking by men, and similarly the issue of domestic violence, and that is dramatically requires change and is going to take time. Because they are much slower, and I think the onus on this lies also with men, and not just with women. And I finally want to say that empowerment is a process. It's not that you say, well, we are disempowered today and you arrive at empowerment tomorrow. Whether it's gender empowerment or race empowerment, it's a process, and we've been moving forward quite dramatically in many ways. If you look at India's situation at independence, and if you look at the situation today, on many counts there've been changes. On many other counts, there haven't. So I won't give you a year. I think that would be very foolish to even attempt to answer that. But I think the processes by which this should happen is what we can talk about much more. Women's movement, but also movement by men to recognize that inequalities, economists talk about inequality aversion. And I think we need to have a widespread social aversion against inequalities. And then we'll begin to arrive at a horizon where we can say, yes, we can see it just out there.
Well, thank you for this answer. Thank you for a most interesting conversation. I would only advise you to stay safe. We know that the pandemic is worsening in India these days, but I also know that you have a beautiful park near your home where you can go for walks and meditate and stay safe at the same time. And I would also like to thank our audience for being with us at this time, and those who can read Italian, of course, can buy and read the book Disuguaglianze di genere nelle economie in via di sviluppo, which has just been published by Il Mulino, and thank our hosts Il Mulino for organizing this, and thanks everybody.
Thank you very much, Alessandro, Monica, Valentina, and all my friends and colleagues, and also people I have not met, to have joined us today. Thank you. And I look forward to your critical responses to the volume, including any disagreements.
Thank you.